Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I am back just as Battle of Britain has launched, as alongside it there has been a massive balance patch containing 18 total changes. This is a really big change and I'm a little bit pressed for time, so we're just going to essentially rapid fire through these. We won't go super in depth like I normally do, and I apologize for that, but I won't have time to make that for a while, and by then this video probably won't be that useful, so we're gonna just super quickly fire through these. So let's start off just right away with the 5th Panzer Grenadier. This card has received a total rework. Its new effect is Pincer. After this unit attacks and survives, your other units with an active Pincer get +1/+1. It's also been upped to 3 credits, but it got +1 defense. The obvious reason for this is that the devs have completely removed its ability to be a Fury combo enabler, notably with like the Katusha OTK, but also just a variety of other combo-based decks, allowed the 5th Panzer Grenadiers to deal monstrous amounts of damage. Now the 5th Panzer Grenadier is like some sort of like modest buffing unit, or works in a very pincer-heavy deck, both of which just doesn't seem good. If the 5th Panzer Grenadier was better statted, like if it was like say a 3/4, I could see it, because then if you attack with another whatever unit you pincer it with, then both of them get +1/+1 and it's like a 3 credit 4/5 infantry. I think at that it probably would have been good, but as is, you have to attack with it and you get a 3 credit 3/4 infantry that maybe gave another unit +1/+1. I think that's the most common scenario, and I just don't see it being good. And as such, I'm a bit sad. Whether or not you thought that they needed to completely, I guess, delete like Katusha OTK from the game is something I'll let people discuss in the comments, but I feel like this new version is just too understated, and I think it's too weak. Next up, we have the Obis DA 7513. It has gotten +1/+1 to its stats. Instead of a 1/2, it is a 2/3, but it notably has had Alpine removed from it. So now you have to essentially run a non-Alpine Italian unit to get this effect. And I think that's a notable nerf to the deck, because one, you're not getting a monstrously sized artillery piece for 3 credits anymore, but you're also just not going to have as many Alpine units in the deck. Granted, German, Italy, Alpine have a lot of extra Alpine units to make use of, but even still, just having a couple units that don't have Alpine could make openers or certain hands weaker. It doesn't feed into the chain. It is a bit better statted, but it's essentially just like a vanilla artillery piece now, and otherwise it's not anything particularly like game-breaking with its giant artillery stats. I expect it to probably still be run in Alpine, just because the effect is so good and so strong, but I do think it's a nice little nerf. I will say I think that Alpine needed maybe a little bit more of a change, notably to the Jabrig's Pioneer 95, which didn't get changed, and that's a bit crazy to me. That card is pretty problematic, and I wish they had changed it. I think that would have dragged Alpine down a little bit more if they had found a good change for it. But because of that, the Obis is the only change to Alpine, and it's a fine change. I guess we'll see if it drags Alpine down enough, but I expect probably for the Pioneer to get changed in the next patch. Next up, we have the Pby Catalina. Very simply, it went from a 3/5 to a 3/4. It has just lost 1 health point, which I think is fine. The Catalina has been in like every US deck as a consistent staple since its release, and now it's just a little bit easier to remove. You're still probably just going to see it in every single deck though. Then we move on to the 2nd California. This one has gotten a complete almost overhaul, so it is now a 5 credit, 1 operation cost, 6/3 infantry. It has Blitz, and when this unit is damaged, give it -2/-1 instead. So now it is losing 2 attack every time it takes damage. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that would balance it out, because the minus attack allows 2nd California to eventually become a non-unit. Unless you're actively buffing it to give it extra attack, it only takes 1 or 2 points of damage, and 2nd California is like a 2-3. And that's just not a threat, especially because after it very quickly bottoms out at 0 attack, and that makes 2nd California essentially just a sticky unit. I'm hopeful that it is going to be less annoying to face, because you're able to offset its stickiness by just making it not a threat. But that Blitz does give it a lot of hitting power, and it's cheaper, so, you know, like, it seems to be like 2nd California is moving to be still remain like an actual card, just not as annoying, and hopefully that's how it works out. I do have some reservations about it being 6 credits to put it in the front line. I think maybe it could have had a 2 operation cost or something like that. But I do think it's overall going to be less annoying than the current version, so I think it's at least moving in the right direction. Moving on, we have now Scorched Earth. Its text has been changed to set the operation cost of all units on the battlefield to 4. So it no longer blows your own units up, and it's a flat rate. It doesn't allow you to stack them. You're no longer able to stack Scorched Earth, which is another nerf to combo-based decks. But this also might make Scorched Earth a card that could see play in a deck that isn't combo. You know, maybe there's like some control decks that would be willing to use this against aggro, because 4 operation cost does severely damage decks that want to have multiple units on the board. So, you know, and it doesn't kill your own units, so you can also play this while you have like your own guard out and you don't screw yourself over. So, you know, I think it's going to be less effective in a combo deck, but might be more effective as like a 1 or 2 of tech card in other decks, which I think is fine. I really haven't ever liked Scorched Earth when it could just like make your units like 8 operation cost and then suddenly you can't ever use them. So I think overall good change. And those are the 5 nerfs. So now we're on to buffs. So 28 Jaeger Regiment. It has got +1 attack, so it is now a 3/1 smoke screen, and then it gains ambush while on the front line. So the Jaeger has become actually a little, I think, a much more solid 1-drop. 3 attack is that break point in the early game and it's the difference between killing a unit and not. Jaeger can now successfully pretty much kill every early game unit outright. You know, when it had 2 attack, it couldn't do that. It also makes the ambush notably better, because now stuff like the cheap 1/3 tanks, like the Panzer II or the Greyhound, can no longer attack into it while it's in the front line. It's still vulnerable to pings, with that 1 health, but maybe there, like I talked about a while ago, or I've talked about a couple times before, Germany getting a modestly powerful infantry at 1 credit could be really strong, because it allows them to not have to rely on their ally to do it. And I'm for certain going to at least try out Jaeger a couple times and see how it does, because it can at least be effective in like a mirror match for at least trading, while also enabling stuff like the Panzer 35 and also something like the BF 109 Trop. Or Trope, I think. Or Trop, sorry. No. Trop. It's, yeah. Ooh, I fumbled a little bit. Anyway, yeah, I think Jaeger is overall an improvement on the card. But let's jump over quickly to the Skytrain. So Skytrain has gotten a complete overhaul. It is now 3 credits with 2 operation costs. It is a 0/4 fighter. And at the end of your turn, add a random 1-cost U.S. infantry unit to your support line. So this is, I think, a significantly better card. It comes down quick, it's constantly spawning 1-drops, and if you look at the US list of 1-drops, most of them outside of Jasko are pretty nice. They're nice, decent filler units, and because you're getting them every single turn, the Skytrain is a must-deal-with threat, and it can be very effective to combo this up in an aggressive deck where you're able to have other units that are attacking and threatening the enemy. And then you just have Skytrain constantly giving you extra fodder to shove into the front line or trade with. I think it's significantly better and probably works its way into US aggro. Next up, we have the first Regiment Etranger. I'm butchering that, I know, apologies. But it's simply getting -1 operation cost, so it is now a 5 credit, 1 operation cost unit. And that makes it a little bit better. Previously you had to spend 7 credits to use to get it into the front line. Now you only got to spend 6. It's not unreasonable for the 1st Regiment to be like a 6-6 or a 7-7, especially against slower decks. So it being able to apply that pressure a little bit quicker, I think, is overall a nice little improvement. And I think it will just make it maybe a little bit more worthwhile considering. Maybe it won't fit into resistance decks, as those have very strict slots, but I could also see it maybe appearing in like a mobilized deck as like time of a top-end mobilized unit, you know, because if you're against control and they have a lot of cards, again, you know, a 6-6 blitz infantry, you know, that also has mobilize and keeps growing could be quite good. Next up, we have the ISU 152 receiving a complete rework. This is a theme we're going to see. A lot of elites got heavily reworked. So now it is 9 credits, up from 7. It also has 3 operation cost, up from 2. It is now a 6-4, which its stats got flipped. It has heavy armor 2, as it did before. And it has deployment, destroy all other damaged units. So now the ISU 152 is potentially a board clear. However, it also has the potential to backfire and kill your own units. And that is notable in the Soviets, as the Soviets are a nation that aren't like Japan, where to the last man is essentially just kill all enemy units. The Soviet Union almost entirely has to have units on the board in order to make to be an effective value deck. So the ISU has to come down at specific times, or you have to really work to get the ISU to be an only enemy-based board wipe. And that's, I think, some interesting thing. I like that it has that dynamic where you're going to have to, you know, both players can play around it by damaging each other's units. And maybe you don't want to play the ISU because it'll kill your, you know, heavy tank, you know, or your giant guard, you know, and you want to save it until the enemy plays out, you know, more units that they can feed into it. There is also, like, synergy. For example, Winter Warfare is 1 credit and combines with the ISU to make it a 10 credit board clear. But that is 2 cards, and it does involve running Winter Warfare while also killing all your own units, any you have on board. So, you know, it probably will be effective, but it might not be that strong, or it might not even be worth running. And you just run the ISU alongside stuff like sickles and maybe some cheap units, and then you can trade out as you need it. I think it's a good buff to Soviet value overall. It's another board clear alongside Winter Offensive, which is, I think, giving them 2 board clears at elite, I think gives them just enough removal that it's not problematic, but enough that it will feel like the deck can keep up. Next up, we have the Wellington. It is a 6 credit, 2 operation cost, so it's down 2 credits, and it keeps its operation cost. But its attack has dropped from 4-4 to 3-4, but now it has Blitz and costs 1 less order to deploy for each order you've given this battle. So now it is, after you cast 6 orders, this is a 0 credit 3-4 Blitz Bomber. I expect the Wellington to probably show up in a lot more decks now. Obviously, people are probably going to think of Commandos first off, which a cheap Blitz Bomber could add some extra damage or removal to the deck, and that seems fine. But I also expect it to probably start showing up in stuff like Brit Control and British Air now even. Because again, 6 orders is just not that hard for Britain to really fulfill. And once you've gotten it down to 0 credits, a 3-4 bomber for free, you know, you just have to pay the 2 operation costs. Quite powerful. I expect the Wellington to probably become almost a staple in a lot of British decks. Then, moving on, we have the Panzer 61 BP42. It has now had its effect changed. It now has deployment, add to your support line 2 59 Panzer Grenadier with Blitz. For those that don't know, the 59 Panzer Grenadier is a 3-2 infantry that essentially can act like a tank. So this is a lot of stats coming off of a single unit. That is an 11-13 worth of stats. Now the Panzer does have that 5 operation cost containing the highest stat total, and that's quite a lot. But on the other hand, deploying it across 3 bodies means that even if they deal with like the Panzer itself, you still have 2 3-2 tanks essentially on the board. And that's, I think, a nice effect. I do wish it was maybe 8 8 credits, because then you could use both Panzer Grenadiers. But maybe that was a balancing thing, that if you had 8 credits and you could use both, that was maybe a little bit too much. It's a similar thing to like tractor factories, where it's 8 credits, so you can only move and operate one of your T-34s if you wanted to attack with them into the support lines. So I'm thinking that's probably like it's a similar thought process to that, as tractor factories is another elite that it reminds me of. I think overall it's much better, and I could see it appearing in German control now as like a late game threat, just because it's effective at pressuring people, and it just is a lot of it's a lot of stats combined into one card. You know, I could see it being similar to, say, the Tiger 1E and certain other German late game elites, where it could really you know, pressure the enemy, and just provide like this very big, hard to deal with threat. Then we move on to Rule the Skies. Rule the Skies, it simply, instead of giving your air units +1 attack when you trigger it, it now gives +1/+1. And that is, I think, a significant buff. I don't think Japan Air will become relevant at the moment. It's just a little bit too far out there. But I think Rule the Skies offers now a legitimate reason to run Japan Air. It's going to become... Eventually, it should become probably like one of the foundational cards for a Japan Air deck. But we need to see more support for that deck before we really play it. But I think it's overall a good buff. Rule the Skies, I don't think will be seen much right now, but I think in the future it's something to keep an eye on. Then we have the 503rd Motors. So the 503rd Motors has had its cost dropped by 1, going from 4 credits to 3 credits. I think that's a nice buff. I think it's a very good buff to tokens, and overall makes the 503rd Motors significantly better. Most notably, I want to say that that it is easier to buff your light infantry now, because it's cheaper. You can maybe squeeze out an extra light infantry and get that +1/+1 on them. And it's also notably almost the same stats as East Surrey Regiment. It loses 1 health for its deployment effect, so that's quite powerful, and I think it's a significantly better card. Will that be enough to drag tokens up? I don't expect so, but I think it's a good buff to them, you know, and maybe, you know, if you're playing it and having fun with it, I think Motors is now a legitimately good card to consider in it. Then we have the Churchill Mark IV, and it simply got +1 defense, so now it's a 2/7. I think that makes it a better guard. For a long time, Churchill has just been outclassed by other guards, but now it's got a lot of health, and that heavy armor makes it very hard to trade into, making it a very durable guard. Also works better with stuff like naval support in Rule Britannia, which I think is good. You know, because that's where the Churchill has really been its only home. But maybe now we'll see it as a legitimate option for something like a legit control deck, and they just run the Churchill because it's just a solid guard now, which I think is nice. You know, Churchill hasn't seen any play in so long outside of newer player decks, so I think a good little buff. The 9.2 Coastal has got a rework. It went from a 4/4 to a 3/6 artillery piece, and damage dealt by this unit adds equal defense to your HQ. This is, I think, a great buff for new players. Previously, those British control decks late game have always had struggled when you're on a budget, because so much of Britain's late game power came from its special and elites. But the Coastal gun now adds a lot of nice power to the late game of that deck. It's very durable, and even on its own, I think it's very good now, healing you constantly, but it also works with buffs, and I'm thinking notably stuff like naval support and Rule Britannia, I think, will really like this. And I think that a naval support deck, if you build it as a newer player, is now much better between the Churchill and the Coastal gun. And I think that's a very nice thing, because maybe now you can actually run that deck and make it a viable budget version of British control, which is just something we just haven't seen up until now. Moving on, we have the ATS. It went from 4 credits to 3 credits. I think that's a fine little buff. The ATS was quite expensive to get out, but it does have arguably one of the strongest effects with drawing a card every time you attack the enemy HQ. it still is a bit awkward because Britain is so good at drawing cards, but I could see maybe there's certain aggressive decks that would really benefit from this. You know, just being able to passively draw cards while you're just doing your thing of attacking HQs. You know, it's not a bad thing, you know, like, but you do need to do it. You need to trigger it about 2 times to be equal to a convoy, and then after that you start doing better. So you definitely want to try to draw this early. So I think you might have to do some deck building constrictions, or you might have to still run other draw, but, you know, it might give, you know, a deck like British Air, or maybe those new, British ground-based aggro decks, maybe those can better leverage the ATS. That, you know, we're going to try out. We're definitely expect, I think, a British ground aggro deck in the future, and I'm going to try ATS out in there. But I think it's a fine little buff. It's a little bit easier to use. Then root out the enemy. Got a bit of a weird change in my opinion. It went from give all units -2/-2 until your next turn. It now just gives all units -1/-2 permanently. So I think this makes it a better anti-aggro card, because the -1 attack permanently sticking, I think, is much more effective than the -2 attack for that turn, because you were often using root out the enemy to either kill everything. You were usually using root out the enemy to kill all the small-sized enemies. But now, if there's large units on the board, root out the enemy can also shrink them a little bit. It does also hurt your units permanently, but you can often maneuver around that. It's still probably a good anti-aggro card, and is honestly even a little better, I think. Which I think is a bit weird, because it was already a good card. So I don't really understand the reason this was changed, in all honesty. And then the final card is Target Acquired. It is a 1 credit, down from 2. And I think that makes it a little bit better. Notably, I think it has some interesting applications now. It being potentially 1 credit means that you could very cheaply blow up an enemy guard or something like that. Maybe Jagro will want to use it, or maybe it could even start showing up in something like an air-based deck, or something that has a lot of artillery. You know, you're able to get those attacks in without losing your unit, and then Target Acquired blows them up for cheap. I think it's a fine little buff. Overall, I mostly like this patch. As I said before, I think the only change I don't like the 5th Panzer Grenadier change. I think this was too, like, I'm fine with the rework, but I think it's a little too weak, and I think it's going to fade into obscurity. The 2nd California, we'll see how it goes. I think it's better than it was, but I'm hesitant to say that it's perfectly fixed. We may in the future see another nerf to it, but I think it's at least a little more tolerable now. And then I kind of wish the 95th, or the Jabrig's Pioneer 95 would have seen play, or would have seen a nerf. I think that needed to be toned down. Also, the argument I've seen is that for British Air, it could have taken a nerf, and I could go either way on that. I think on one hand, British Air was so dominant in the meta, specifically because Alpine was so popular, and it was just a really good matchup against it, and against the decks that were able to counter Alpine, you know, because we've seen British Air almost always remain like this, you know, tier 1 or tier 2 deck, you know, and it fluctuates between there. It's always there at least, you know, in the peripheral, and you know, like, we've seen that metas can adapt and better deal with that with British Air without, like, having to heavily tech against it like they have against, say, Alpine. You know, British Air just has more weaknesses, and it does have cards that you can use to exploit it, and, you know, make it a bit easier to deal with. You know, so maybe it needed a nerf. I guess we'll see what the meta changes to, or if it changes at all. But otherwise, that is going to be it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know down in the comments any thoughts you have on these balance changes. And I would definitely say in the future, expect a couple deck techs with the new Battle of Britain cards, as they have just come out. And I'm going to be brewing and testing those out. Otherwise, have a good day.